Western discourse, and even movies, actually, not just in writing. And so the first one is sky burial, which you may already be familiar with, and the second is the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And so when you think about Tibetan funerary practices, often these things will come to mind. I would tell students, so I actually live with undergraduate students as a tutor at Harvard, and so I tell them what I'm working on, and they'd always say, oh, don't they like feed the corpse to birds? Like everyone seems to know this one thing. And so this fascination with sky burial actually goes back a very long ways. And so the first reference we have to this comes from this character. His name's Odoric of Pordenone. Amazing life. He's an Italian missionary who travels by foot mostly, but also by boat, all the way to China from Italy, and all the way back. And he has a chapter in his travelogue, and it has this title that always makes me laugh a little. It's On the Kingdom of Tibet, Where Dwells the Pope of the Idolaters, which is such a ridiculous statement just in itself. And so in that chapter, it's really short. This is what he says. He says, then the priests cut his whole body into pieces, so this is someone who's died, which, once they have finished doing this, they then carry back, holding the pieces above their heads and making speeches in the dead man's honor, along with all who knew him. After these events are carried out, eagles and vultures descend from the mountains, and this way each one takes off a bit of him and takes it away. Then the son immediately takes his father's head, which he cooks and consumes. He fashions himself a goblet, however, from a bone fragment or some piece of the skull, from which he and all those in his household always drink with devotion, and also in memory of his deceased father. Now, about 100 years ago, a scholar named Bertold Laufer wrote a piece on Odoric's chapter on Tibet, and he argues very persuasively that Odoric actually didn't go to Tibet. This is just based on lore that he encountered in China. But what's really interesting is that Laufer also makes the case that the Pope of the Idolaters is actually Chogyal Pakpa, who's a very famous figure in Tibetan history, because the word he used is almost like Pakpa. I mean, it's sort of like a garbled version of Pakpa, but that's who he's referring to, just through Chinese channels. And Matt would be familiar with Pakpa very well because of Pakpa's importance for Tibeto-Mongol relations. But this is very apropos my interest because, as it turns out, Pakpa is the great nephew of Drapa Gyaltsen, and so my dissertation was on Drapa Gyaltsen. And so these three figures, these are three of the founding members of the Sakya school of Tibetan Buddhism. And Drapa Gyaltsen wrote probably the most influential works on Tibetan funerary practices, at least the tradition that I'm going to talk about today, ever. Everyone cites his works. And we know that Chogyal Pakpa was trained in the practices that his great-uncle had developed. And I spent years at Harvard reading these sources, and I can assure you that cannibalism is nowhere to be found, and he's not an advocate of that. But yeah, so the Western fascination with sky burial and things more horrifying goes back a long way. The second thing that comes to mind, and we'll come back to later in the talk, is the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And that's like a title given to it by this gentleman on the right, Walter Evans Wentz. He's going full Orientalist in this photo, as you can see with his clothing. But the title of the text is really Liberation Through Hearing in the Bardo. And this represents a quite different tradition of funerary practices from the ones that I ended up studying. And so when I discovered this tradition that basically no one had looked at, was super important for the Sakya school, it's still practiced today, not even just in the Sakya school, it's actually practiced in the Gaelic tradition, in the Kagi school. I thought, okay, great, this is a great topic for me to take on for my thesis. I personally think about dying all the time. I find it very therapeutic to do so. And so I thought this will be like intrinsically motivating to just take this on as my thesis, because it's a long haul when you're writing a dissertation. So the tradition that I studied for my dissertation is based on this one particular tantra, and it's called the Sarvadurvadi Parashodhana Tantra. SDP is the usual acronym for it. And so this text it's actually one of the first tantras that was translated into Tibetan during the imperial period. And it remained actually a very important text basically from the 8th century onwards. And what's really striking about it is that the imperial rulers of Tibet were a little afraid of certain elements of this tantra. It had some practices that seemed a little powerful and frightening. One practice in particular, it's called the Abhichara Homa rite, does recommend using human flesh and blood. And so they actually censored the Tantra. So when it was first translated, it was censored. So there were parts of it that were removed by the imperial powers. Eventually, though, Drapa Gilson, he has this really cool text where he talks about the history of this Tantra. And he says that Tibetan scholars used a Khotanese manuscript to retrieve these missing passages, which I think is super interesting, that Tibetan scholars were looking at Khotanese texts. I mean, that's in itself just really interesting in itself. But, and what else about this? So we know that the Sarvadurti Parashodhana Tantra was used for imperial funerals. So this is a Tantra that does have sections that talk about funerary practices. We know that it is authentically very old because it's in the earliest imperial catalogs. So it's named in those sources. Matt, you were just at Dunhuang very recently. So we don't have like a full version of the Sarvadurti Parashodhana Tantra in Dunhuang, but we have fragments. And so we have mantras from it. We have the Shakyamuni mandala. So there's like traces of it. So you can see its influence kind of spreading out from, the center of power out to, where Tibet had once been influential further afield. And what else can we say about it? And so what's cool is that this text is the only Tantra belonging to the Yoga Tantra class. So this isn't like in the highest Yoga Tantra class, which I'll explain this a bit later. It's sort of a rung down in the doxography of Tantra. But what's interesting is that of all the Yoga Tantric texts that Tibetans have, and there are a lot of them, this is the only one that today is still used basically daily. So Gelugpas still use it, Sakyupas use it all the time for funerary practices, and as I said, Kagyupas as well. I think there's also a Bunpo variation, but I haven't studied that yet. So, to give you a sense of what this Tantra says and how this relates to funerary practices. So there's this really cool introductory narrative, and it involves this god, Vimalamani Prabha, who here at the bottom isn't doing so well, and you'll find out why in a second. So the story goes that the Buddha was in this heavenly grove, and he had this huge retinue. This is how the Tantra starts. And then he surprises everyone by firing light out of his forehead, and he illuminates basically the entire universe. And by doing that, he frees countless beings, this is what it says, from the bonds of their defilement. So basically, he spares them from the bad karma that they have. And so the retinue sees this, and they're shocked, and they say, hey, like, how'd you do that? And he said, well, I have these incredible stores of merit, so it's actually very easy for me as a Buddha to just liberate beings just by shooting light out of my forehead. And so they're very impressed by this, and they say, hey, actually, our friend Vimalamani Prabha, he died a week ago, so where's he? I mean, did you just save him? And he's like, actually, no, he's in hell. And so this is him. And so he says that he's going to spend 12,000 years in like the worst of hells, and then he's going to move up to a slightly less painful hell for another 10,000 years. And then he's going to spend another 10,000 years kind of cycling between like animal and like ghost rebirths. And then he'll be a human, but he's going to be living among the border people, which is like an interesting claim. The Sanskrit is pratyanta jana and takokimi in Tibetan. So he won't be living in like a central area, but somewhere rural, which apparently is a really bad thing. And then after that, he'll spend 84,000 years with all these particular ailments, like a lot of bleeding and sort of like skin diseases and things like that. And so they're really horrified that their friend, who had just been a god, is suddenly in this hellish state. And so they say, well, what can we do to save him? I mean, you just did save so many people and well beings. So what can we do? And he says, well, there are rituals that we can perform. And so let me explain how to perform these rituals. So the Tantra, a lot of the Tantra, not all of it, but a lot of it is spelling out the rituals that you can perform to rescue the deceased from any kind of unfortunate rebirth. And so this brings us to Drapa Gyaltsen. So Drapa Gyaltsen, as I said, he's one of the founding figures of the Sakya school of Tibetan Buddhism. He had to deal with a lot of death in his life. He lost his father when he was quite young. His father was really the founding figure of the Sakya school as a distinct tradition of practice in Tibetan Buddhism. And so he presided over that funeral, that's what his biographies say. His brother died quite young, so he presided over that funeral, and even his younger brother also died before him. And then I'm sure there would have been many other funerals, but those are the ones that are named. These are very patriarchal texts, and they talk about the men. And so, in any case, he wrote a lot about funeral practices, but his fixation was actually on funerary practices based on this root tantra, the Sarvadurgini. And so he wrote this really great text, which was the centerpiece of my thesis, called Light Rays for the Benefit of Others. And of course, it's referencing this whole story about the light saving people. And this is him and his brother, by the way. So Dropic Gilson, he's older on the right, because he actually got to about age 70. Son of Samo, his brother who died young, still has dark hair on the left. And so he spends a lot of time unpacking, well really it's most of the text, unpacking the different methods, as he sees it, that you can perform for saving the dead. So there's not just one, there's like all kinds of rituals that you can undertake. And this is all based on the Tantra, but he has to do some work to kind of, like the Tantra is a little bit laconic, it doesn't always expand on things. He goes on for 20, 30 pages just on like a single line. So he's expanding a lot on what the Tantra is saying, just to give his readers like a very clear sense of what you would actually have to do if you're performing these rituals. And so I'm gonna, just as more context before we get into some of the more theoretical stuff that I had to contend with as I wrote my thesis, I'll try to unpack and give you a sense of like what these methods involve, very briefly. So the first is empowerment. So basically empowerment is something anyone who's familiar with Tibetan Buddhism will be already familiar with. Basically, it's just like what you would do if you're initiating someone into a particular practice, like a certain deity's practice, except you do it with the corpse as well. So Dropic Gilson spends probably the most time unpacking this particular practice. It's very complicated, way too complicated to get into here. But the long and short of it is that the ritual performer will more or less merge with the Buddha Vairochana through a series of visualization practices, and then ultimately introduce the disciples who are present performing the ritual with you and the deceased via the corpse, or sometimes just a physical representation of the dead if they don't have the body. So introduce them into the mandala, and then the point is that it's a bit like how the Mormons will baptize someone after they're dead and then they're saved. But even though they're gone, you introduce them into these practices, and then wherever they are, the merit from that will propel them to a better rebirth. And then they can practice the deity's practices in whatever happy Pure Land they're in, and then quickly gain salvation. So that's number one. Number two is interesting. It's like a separate category. It's just recitations. Like if you just say the mantras enough, and it's a lot. It's like 100 million times. So you have to think, okay, like logistically, how does one do it? I guess if you had a huge group of people all doing it at once, that's what Tibetans often do. That's another method, though. Often you would probably start with the empowerment, ideally, but you can supplement with this. But it does stand alone as a method. And so that's one. Repelling negative forces. This one is a little more complicated. Basically, you take the cremated remains, so there's no sky burial in this case, it's all cremation. This is what the Tantra recommends. And so you mix the ashes with white mustard seed and sand, and you call the name of the deceased, and you recite specific mantras. And then, this is the most important part, you scatter the mixture into a river that flows into an ocean. And so then, once you do that, they'll be liberated from bad rebirths. So that's the formula. Very interesting. And then the fourth is burnt offering rites. So this can take 4 forms. Typically with a burnt offering, it's something you do repeatedly. Through ritual means, you throw this offering substance into the fire. So you're basically offering to Vairochana in most cases. Could be other deities, but in this case it would be Vairochana. If that has been successful, and you look for signs, there are these sort of miraculous signs that will appear if you've been successful in sparing your relative or friend from bad rebirths by doing this, then there are things you can do to even make it better. So you can perform a burnt offering rite that basically extends their time in this Pure Land. You can do one that is called the overpowering burnt offering rite, and so that actually positions the person you're focused on, whoever that might be, into a position of power over the deities who are there, which I find interesting. That's like a more lofty goal. And then the Abhichara Homa burnt offering rite is the one that the imperial rulers were concerned with. That's quite fierce. So this is a way to overcome obstacles. So it's like a more wrathful practice. And so if there are these wrathful deities who are interfering in matters, then you can do this burnt offering and that will stop them. And then cremation seems like that's already a basic method, that's built into some of the other ones, but Dr. Gelson says this can be a standalone method on its own. It's not just simply cremating the body. What's really fascinating is that you actually create a physical mandala in the pit that you're going to cremate the body in. So you have to create a rather elaborate mandala. You place the body into that pit, and then you invite Agni, the fire god, to enter into the ritual space. And then you basically invite everyone into the belly of Agni. And this is part of the purification practice. And then finally, once this has been completed, this very wrathful deity called Trilokavijaya comes and steps on the bad karma of the deceased. So literally tramples their negative karma. That's like the visual they give. And that will purify them and send them off to a better rebirth. One of my favorites is producing a reliquary. So this isn't simply basically creating a stupa. What you actually do is you take the ashes, then you take the 5 products of a cow, so it's urine, dung, milk, butter, and curd. And so you mix that with some nice smelling water, put that in a vase, and then you kind of mix it into sort of like a doughy substance, because you put some clay in there and some sand. And once you have the dough substance, you literally with your hands take their remains, mix with these substances, and you form it into the shape of a stupa. I don't know if you've ever seen a stupa. I don't have a picture, but it's I don't know how to describe it except it's a reliquary. Or a deity. So you have 2 options. You can either take this mass of ash and other substances and make it look like a statue, or make it look like a reliquary. And so that practice on its own, of course coupled with mantra recitation, basically there's always mantras involved and visualizations of some kind, that will purify their karma. And then finally, there will be cases, of course, when someone passes away and you don't have the body. So maybe they fell down a ravine or they drowned, got swept away in a river. And so Dr. Gelson says, don't worry, there's a lot you can do. In fact, you can really do any of these, and this is sort of the end of the text. He's like, any of the practices I just outlined are fine, but you need to use some kind of physical object. There needs to be a material thing that you involve in place of the corpse. So it could just be their name written on a piece of paper. It could be something more like an effigy. But in any case, you just need something. And then things like empowerment and the recitations, you can do all those and just direct it at this ritual support, they call it. Okay, so as you might have gathered, what's really striking about these practices is that they don't really expect anything of the dead. So the dead are not asked to do anything. They remain almost entirely passive throughout. And that's quite striking, because you could have someone who has really bad karma. The Tantra is very clear about this. The Sarvadurgati says, even someone who's committed really terrible acts and has murdered multiple people, if you perform these rites accurately, you can save them. It's a really shocking claim. I mean, it really turns Buddhist karma theory upside down. And so the question I had when I was reading the sources was, okay, I want to emically, sort of on the inside, kind of understand, what's the logic? This is kind of a shocking claim. So how are they imagining the sort of the mechanics of this? Just this is sort of one element of my dissertation. I wanted to try to get a sense of this, and so I thought, okay, well, I should consider issues of agency then. So if they're not doing the work, and the ritualist and the rituals are, well, so who exactly is responsible? I mean, is it really just the ritual performer? Can we just say it's the rituals? It's not really saying very much if we just say it's the rituals. We should try to be a little more specific. And then when it comes to asking a question how should we understand agency in this context? I also had to ask, well, why does this even matter? And I'm going to, at the end, come back to this and explain why it mattered ultimately for me understanding the historical nature of my project and what it showed about the history of funerary practices in Tibet. But also just for understanding the more theoretical dimensions that I'm going to get into now. Okay, so theories of agency. So this is what I came to. I had to basically start doing some reading into agency and try to get a sense of, what scholars of religion and philosophers have said about agency, and try to understand how I can use some of their insights and when reading these sources, these ritual manuals. So broadly speaking, agency denotes the ability to act and to impact others. So that's like the most general definition we could give. I quickly discovered that many Western thinkers root theories of agency in intentional action. So they're very focused on intentions. So actions that are consciously initiated by a human agent for the sake of achieving some end. And conveniently, this really squares with Buddhist theories of agency because karma, as some of you may know, is based on intentional actions of body, speech, and mind. If you don't intentionally do something, you don't, incur bad karma. So the focus on intention, even though that can be a very fraught category in the humanities kind of writ large, it's something that is taken very seriously in Buddhist sources and certainly is not thrown out the door by many philosophers of agency. And I came to the work a little later. I'm going to kind of start with the end and kind of work backwards to how I thought through the agency questions. But it brought me to the work of a figure named Alfred Gell. And so Alfred Gell, he argues that agency can be attributed to persons and things which initiate events caused by acts of mind, will, or intention. So the key is persons and things. This was very intriguing to me because there's so many material objects that are used in these rituals. I thought, okay, this could be good. So Gell says that linking intention to agency is important because it allows us to differentiate between mere happenings caused by physical laws, so that's just like water rolling down a hill, and then actions. So actions that are caused by prior intentions, such as like pouring water from a vase. So he says, look, there's a difference here. But as I said, what's really interesting about his approach to theories of agency is that he doesn't want to limit it to persons, ultimately. And so this is a quote I found very helpful. So he says, I am prepared to make a distinction between primary agents, that is, intentional beings, who are categorically distinguished from mere things or artifacts, and secondary agents, which are artifacts, dolls, cars, works of art, etc., through which primary agents distribute their agency in the causal milieu, and thus render their agency effective. So let me unpack what he's saying here a little bit. So he's basically saying that agency is exercised in an environment that consists of material things. So we act in a material world, very basic. But he argues that the objects that are involved in an action form a part of our identity as an agent. So he has this idea of distributed personhood. And so there can be physical things in the world that we have had some sort of interaction with that can become extensions of our agency in different ways. And so he gives a bunch of examples of this. And so he gives one example. I have a quote here. If we think of an anti-personnel mind, not as a tool made use of by a conceptually independent user, but more realistically, as a component of a particular type of social identity and agency, then we can more readily see why a mind can be seen as an agent. That is, but for this artifact, this agent, the soldier plus mind, could not exist. So he's saying, if you have a soldier who's spreading landmines around, then his identity as a soldier is constituted by the physical things that he is expressing his agency through. And so his distributed personhood is him as a person physically, and then these landmines that later kill people and sort of act out his agency at a later time. He's not even there, right? So, I mean, you could say they're tools, but Gell wants to make a stronger point and say these are actually secondary agents. These are like extensions that connect someone to social others, sometimes in a very violent way. And so I found this to be quite interesting, and I'll explain how this really helped me understand my sources better in a second. But my initial theoretical impulse was actually to start with Bruno Latour, who's frankly a lot more popular these days. People love Latour. He's like really in vogue, and for good reason. He's super smart. He's super interesting. But he has like a quite different view of agency. I mean, he's similar in that he sees material things as having a kind of agency, but he wants to make like a much stronger and frankly more radical point. And so this quote kind of sums it all up from his really great book, Reassembling the Social, he says, if action is limited a priori to what intentional, meaningful humans do, it's hard to see how a hammer, a basket, a door closer, a cat, a rug, a mug, a list, or a tag could act. The questions to ask about any agent are simply the following. Does it make a difference in the course of some other agent's action or not? And so Latour's idea is that let's not focus on intentions. Let's just say that any physical thing that makes any difference in anyone's course of action, or anything's course of action, is an actor of sorts. I mean, he's not dumb. He recognizes that, humans, are not to be equated fully with, a table, or a water bottle or something like that. But he really wants to create a greater degree of symmetry between sentient beings, like us, and physical things. And so he imagines the world as this network of actors. So whenever we're acting, we're always acting in concert with many, many, many other actors that are either opposing us or facilitating our activity. And so it's actually quite in sync with Buddhist ideas of dependent origination, interdependence. It syncs quite nicely with that. But there was a bit of a problem for me when I was thinking through my sources. And so when I was reading the ritual manuals, I didn't focus only on Drobby Gelson's text, because Sakyapus and many others wrote a lot about this topic, but my main focus was Drobby Gelson's text. But what I found really troubling is my advisor, Anne Monius, or one of my advisors, had said go with Latour. Latour is going to be really helpful. I remember it was July, I was coming up my final year of my dissertation. And I was trying to use Latour with my sources, and I felt like I was really forcing theory onto my materials. And the reason why it felt like that was that the language that they were using seemed to really stress intentional action and a strong difference between sentient beings and insentient objects. And it's not that there weren't dozens and dozens, probably more like hundreds if not thousands, of material things that were clearly performing critical roles. You couldn't even do the rituals without some of these material things. So clearly I had, when asking the question, who's doing the work of saving the dead, I had to incorporate material things. I can't get away from the material, it's so important. But at the same time, the language of the text would not support Latour's position that intention didn't matter. And so I felt like I was just, it was in an awkward moment as a scholar when you have a cool theory, but it's not gelling with your sources. And so it was actually through another book by a guy named Lambros Malaforos. He was talking about Gell. I hadn't really heard of Gell until I read this book. And Malaforos loves Latour. And he was really attacking Gell. He's just slamming Gell. A lot of people hate Gell because they think he's too kind of anthropocentric and he doesn't go far enough. And he thinks that really the only agents are actually humans, and which is true to a degree, but not fully. And so it was a little funny because I was reading these critiques of Gell, and I was kind of actually, this really fits with my material. And so that's when I turned to Gell. And so once I had Gell and Latour, I ended up using both in some ways to help me kind of create a broader picture of who does the work of saving the dead, again, to sort of understand the sort of logic of the text as I'm reading. Then I felt better equipped to provide some nice analysis of these sources. And so I'm just going to now kind of take you through the different actors that I was able to identify who contribute to the rescue of the dead. Again, emically, right? I'm saying that this is trying to understand emically how someone like Drobby Gelson is understanding the mechanics of these rites to operate. And so the first one is the ritual manual. And so when you read Light Rays, Drobby Gelson's text, the language is very clear in that it's a text that's designed to be used. So it uses these verb forms. So in Tibetan, the future tense of the future form of a verb, it's not actually strictly speaking a future unless you add an auxiliary to it. It actually has a necessitative sense. So when you have just a bare future form verb in Tibetan, it has the sense of you must or you should do X. And so when you read his text, it's just over and over, you should do this, you should do this, you must do this, next you should do this. And so it's a text that's clearly designed to be, it's a ritual manual, designed to be used, and it has this sort of exhortative power where it's kind of instructing the reader on what to do. And so when you're reading it, you're constantly sort of imagining how a user would be operating in concert with that text. And so it struck me that if we're imagining some ritual performer who is using Drop Gilt's text. One thing I should, just as an aside, I should mention, it struck me early on as well that when you have a text like this, even though it reflects the world in which it's produced, you can't strictly say that it's describing a historical ritual performance. It's actually an idealized type, right? So it's a prescriptive text that's saying one ought to do this. Whether anyone ever did the rites that Drop Giltson outlined as he explained them, we don't know, right? I mean, they probably did something like it. We know that today they do things that are similar, but there's always room for, what's the word? Just sort of modifications and innovations, and that happens over the history of the Sakya school's engagement with these Kunrik rites. They're called the rites based on the Sarvadogadi Parashona Tantra. But in any case, I was trying to imagine someone who's like a very faithful reader of these texts. So you imagine someone who's really trying to follow very closely. And in that case, you really have the ritual performer's actions being scripted, more or less, to a very specific degree, which means that the ritual manual itself, Drop Giltson's text, is, like, in a way, one of the primary agents that's guiding the process. So if you've ever been to Tibetan ritual performance, they always have texts. Even the most accomplished lamas, they still have ritual manuals. It's not like they may have it memorized to a large degree, but they still use those texts. And so you have to recognize that text as an actor in the ritual space. It's dictating what people are doing constantly. And so in that sense, it's kind of one of the primary actors. However, what I found really cool was that Drop Giltson's text has certain moments where it grants very explicitly its reader more freedom than it does in other cases. So in some cases, it will, there's one example where it demands a certain degree of creativity. And so it says, you have to paint this image of Vairochana, and you're actually going to paint yourself into that image as a devotee, kind of bowing down to Vairochana. And so it doesn't give you a lot of detail about what this painting's supposed to look like. It says, go look at the Sarvadogadi itself. It has some instructions. If you go do that, it's like a paragraph. So it's not very detailed. And so in a way, it's giving you a lot of creative freedom. So that would be a moment when a ritual performer has to kind of step away from the instructions of the text and rely on their own training, whatever that might be. And that leads me to the second point. There's this really interesting term that I came across. It's Tongwa Gyupa. You don't see it in any of the canonical literature. You see it in medical texts, and you see it in ritual texts. And I'm going to try to write an article about this eventually. So what this means is visual transmission. And so there are certain practices that are honestly just too complicated to write it in words. It's a bit like if you were to try to even write step-by-step how to tie shoelaces, it's hard. It's easier to show it, right? And so Drop Giltson and many of the other Kunrik texts that I was reading would often say, if you want to know how to design this particular mandala, you should rely on Tongwa Gyupa, which means visual transmission. And so that means however your teacher did it in front of you, whatever you saw growing up as a monk, just follow that. So there's this interesting empirical turn. Janet Gyatso, one of my advisors, talks about this empirical element of Tibetan medicine, and she hadn't actually noticed this term before. So when I presented my thesis to her, she was kind of surprised and was like, "Oh wow, this term didn't jump out at me, but you're right. I'm seeing it also in tantric ritual work. So there's emphasis on the empirical, which we kind of knew anyway, but it's cool to see it made explicit." And then finally, sometimes Drop Giltson, this is probably the most explicit example, he gives choice. So he'll be like, look, if you have a lot of time, do this. If you're really short on time, then do this. And so he'll actually identify the short version and the long version. Sometimes there's even a middle-length version depending on the practice. And so in terms of the network of actors who are tasked with saving the dead in a ritual performance, we'd start with the ritual manual itself. Then we would want to move on next to the ritual agent. So this would be the ritual officiant. Here's an example here. Actually, so as a very brief aside, when I went to Nepal for a year to study, in part for my general exams, but also to prepare for my dissertation work. And so I told some Sakyapa monks that I was really interested in the Kunrik practices, and they said, "Oh, look, it's Yoga Tantra, so it's probably totally okay. It's not highest Yoga Tantra. It's not a secret, but we would still prefer that you get the empowerment in order to read these texts." And I said, "Sure." And so I went down to meet Garshop Rinpoche, who's pictured here, And I was really kind of shocked because in English, after my Kempo friend was explaining my interest in Kunrik rites, he said to me in English, he's like, oh, so you need like a research empowerment. And I was like, wow, I didn't know that research empowerments were a thing, but yes, I need a research empowerment. Because he knew that first of all, I'm not gonna perform these funerals. That's not what I took on this project to learn how to do. And second of all, this isn't typically a practice, like the Vairochana practice, that you would even take on as a personal practice. So he was like, I know you're only gonna use this for research, but I'll give it to you anyway. And so he actually gave me the full Vairochana empowerment. I had to wait a couple months because he was very busy. Which gave me basically full license to talk about all of these sources. The nice thing about it was that they weren't really too protective of it because, again, it wasn't highest yogic tantra. So they said, it's not so secretive. It's very public when we do this, so it's fine. But anyway, so here's an example of a ritual performer. He's actually performing a funeral in this photo, a Kunrik rite. And so throughout the text, the ritual performer, yes, he's doing the work of performing the ritual, but what's really interesting is that over and over and over again, through practices of visualization, and this will tag our discussion yesterday on experience, there's all these passages, very elaborate passages on the practices you use to meet and ultimately merge with certain deities. And it's like one after another. It's not just Vairochana, it's many. And so I have this chart that I borrowed from a Japanese scholar, and this is sort of the mechanics of it, more or less. So you have, the triple action of the meditator, body, speech, and mind. And so through mudra, this is the hand gestures you perform, and mantras, these are the mantras you recite, and then meditation, you have the mind of the deity more or less merging with the mind of the meditator. Same with the speech and then the body. So this is how these sources imagine that the ritual performer comes to identify with the deity. And this is really important because it's not like the ritual performer is just tasked with saving the dead, which again is this is like a major thing to do, right? It's not exactly easy. So it's not like they have to do it alone. The expectation is that you're doing it with the deity's assistance. And so you are guiding the rituals on the ground in the ritual space, but you're bringing in the deity basically into the space and merging with them at certain moments. And by doing that, you gain a kind of power that you otherwise couldn't have. And that's what gives you that capacity. Just like the Buddha in the Sarvadurgati Parishona Tantra, he can liberate beings. Well, you can too, because you've just merged with a particular deity. So that makes it possible, right? Okay, and so finally, material objects. So as I said, there's just so many objects in these texts. I might have a list. Yeah, so here we go. So like a short list of things you would encounter, just to give you examples. So you have, there's a painting that you use at certain points. I'm going to come back to this briefly. You produce like a physical mandala made of sand. That's quite elaborate, takes a lot of time. You have the physical body. You have sometimes effigies, as I mentioned. Of course, there's all the ritual implements like the vajras and the bells. And then sometimes there's always going to be certain offering substances and torma offerings and the like. And then you have even more basic things like certain fabrics, and these are all required, right? So you can't do the rituals without these material things. And so I found very helpful in understanding the role of such objects. My friend James Gentry, who graduated from Harvard maybe 4 years ago, he wrote a great book called Power Objects in Tibetan Buddhism. And so he talks about three types of material objects or ritual objects. And so the first is potent materials help to liberate beings through sensory contact alone. The second is objects that gain power through the ritual operations to which they are subjected, including the mediating functions of deity yoga. And then finally, we don't have to worry about this too much, but props for communication or representation of doctrine. And so what's important for me to stress is that, so James's book deals with a very different set of funerary practices in Tibetan traditions. And so he's looking at cases where you have material objects that are deemed so powerful that contact with them alone is enough to save the dead. And so you might have a pill, a ritually produced pill, that if you ingest it, just by ingesting it, you will be spared negative rebirth. So that's the claim that these sources make, right? There's also things that just by seeing it, that will produce great karma and you'll be spared. And so there are certain objects that have this kind of power. these objects don't exist in the Yoga Tantric context. These do not exist in the Sarvadurgati Parashona Tantra at all. So there are not these kinds of objects. So the Sarvadurgati is an earlier Tantra, 7th century in India that it was written. There's still centuries of more Tantric development that happens in India, and that's when the highest Yoga Tantra tradition is developed. And in those Tantras, you do have powerful substances, right? But not in my sources. And so basically everything that I was looking at fell under the second category that James identified. So these are objects that gain power through the ritual operations to which they are subjected. And so this is where, for me, Gell made such perfect sense. Like if you were to use Latour, and that's what James does actually, so James uses Latour, and others, but he cites Latour, then Latour fits perfectly with highest yoga tantric sources that talk about material objects that actually save the dead. Then it's like, it's just such a clear-cut case where you have a physical material thing, it's like actually specified as an agent. It's like framed, even grammatically, agentively. Like you just can't get around it, right? In my sources, you don't see it at all. You know, the material objects are clearly super important, but they're always more or less like an extension of the agency of the ritual performer or of the deity. They're not like standalone actors who like actually work to save the dead. They're just not framed that way. And so I found Gell's theory quite useful. And so to say like a little bit more about certain objects that my sources talk about. So there's this painting. This is actually just a little segment of a painting that I stayed with like a homestay family for part of my year in Nepal before I moved into the monastery. And my homestay brother was a Tibetan artist. And so I said, hey, like I'm gonna write my thesis on Kunrik rites. Can you paint me Kunrik? And that's it. So he did a great job. And so Kunrik always has 4 faces. This is the 4-face Vairochana. He's white. And so the Sarvadurgati and then Drapa Yeltsin's manual says that during the preliminary practices, you need to produce this painting. It would look something like this, except you would actually paint yourself into it, which I mentioned a bit earlier. But what's so fascinating about this object is that when you think about it, it's an object that you produce as a ritual performer, and then by opening its eyes, it becomes actual. And by that, they mean that sort of the deity comes to exist in the painting in some degree. And so then you have like a physical representation, a material thing, that represents the deity. You've painted yourself into the painting, so then you have like a representation of yourself. So there's this sort of interesting mimicry that's going on. But that object becomes an extension of your agency as a ritual actor, and it becomes an extension of the deity's agency, according to the text. Because the agency of that deity comes to sort of live in the object. So then you have this meeting of the ritual performer and the deity through a painting. And I thought that's so cool. Like you have this material thing that's sort of mediating the connection between the two. Another example is material offerings that you give like a lot, repeatedly throughout the ritual performance. And so what's striking about these is that you will lay out a set of material offerings, and the point of doing that is not only to thank certain deities for the assistance that they're providing, but it's also to really get them there in the first place. And you don't even need to be physically there in order for the things to work, right? So it's a bit like Gell's like landmine example, where you can create a ritual space, and you're not even physically using that thing. You might even be facing away from it, often you would be. But that material object is still doing a kind of work. It's still bringing the deities into the ritual space. And so again, to me, like it made better sense to say, in this case, that these objects only have power insofar as they are ritually connected to the practices that you are performing. And so they gain their efficacy through the performance and really through your agency. And so to me, again, I found Gell's framing of material agency a little more apropos to like the language of the sources I was using. Okay, and so then back to my question about sort of why focus on agency. And so as I said, this highlights the performative work of ritual manuals. So it may not be obvious. I think like in James's book, it's such a cool book, but he doesn't really talk about the work that a physical text can do, at least from what I saw. So that was one thing that I'd like to develop even further as I turn my thesis into a book, understanding kind of like even better and maybe even trying to understand how the intention of authors, it could be framed as like influencing the ritual performance, and whether that's even retrievable or what. But there's a lot of theoretical work I could do with that. And so focusing on the agency will bring the ritual manual into the foreground, which is helpful. As I said, it helps us understand the logic of liberating rites. But lastly, this is something that was kind of an exciting realization for me as I was writing my thesis. It made me realize that there was actually this really kind of major reframing of post-mortem agency, I call it, that occurs in the history of Buddhist Tantra. And so, just to give you kind of like a brief summary of what this is my fourth chapter, what this is about. So, you might have, I mentioned the bardo earlier, you may be already familiar with this idea. The bardo is this intermediate state between lifetimes, right? And so, not all Buddhist schools in the history of Buddhism in India early on accepted the bardo. Some did, some didn't. So the Theravadins don't, actually. Even today, as far as I know, they don't accept a bardo state. But the Sarvastivadins and the Sautrantikas and the Yogacharans did. And the Abhidharmakosha has like a pretty thorough treatment of the bardo, so this is a very important source for Tibetans' understanding of the bardo. But what's really very interesting, and one of my authors even like acknowledges this, is that at that earlier phase, when a being is in the bardo, they don't have any control over what's happening. Okay, so this is important to remember that. So in the earlier phases, yes, there's an intermediate state between lifetimes, but you can't really dictate where you're going to go once you're dead. It's like your karma is just going to propel you, and you're going to end up there. So just like hold that in your mind for a second. Because when you get to the tantra, like the later tantras, you have this incorporation of abhidharmic terminology and ideas into tantric ideas as well. But what you get is this remarkable shift in how postmodern agency is framed. So suddenly, I guess it's about the maybe 10th century, maybe even a little earlier, you have cases where, in these tantric sources, where suddenly, instead of being sort of bound by karma, the bardo becomes this like critical moment that you can take advantage of to become liberated. And that's a big shift. And so we, as a result, get passages like this. So this is from Liberation Through Hearing in the Bardo, or Upon Hearing in the Bardo. Either way is fine. And so I'll read this quote to you. So it's, "O child of the lineage, however terrifying the appearances of the intermediate state of reality might be, do not forget the following words. Go forward remembering their meaning. The crucial point is that through them recognition may be attained. Alas, now, as the intermediate state of reality arises before me, renouncing the mere thought of awe, terror, or fear, I'll recognize all that arises to be awareness manifesting naturally of itself, knowing such sounds, lights, and rays to be visionary phenomena of the intermediate state. At this moment, having reached this critical point, I must not fear the assembly of peaceful and wrathful deities which manifest naturally." And so this is based on earlier highest yoga tantric sources. There are sources that predate the Tibetan Book of the Dead that have the same sort of language and presuppositions, where basically the idea is that you can speak to the dead and help them take advantage of this moment in the intermediate state in order to save themselves. And so this is quite a different paradigm from the Sarvadurgati-based rites that I looked at, because in the Sarvadurgati-based rites, you do not have any opportunity to rescue yourself. So the burden of rescue is always on the ritual performer. The burden of rescue is on all the actors that I just outlined. And so for my fourth chapter, I decided to dig into some of the earlier commentaries on the SDP, see what it says see what they say about the bardo, and then look at the SDP itself. What's really striking is that the Sarvadurgati doesn't mention the bardo at all. It's just not there. It does say that Vimalamani Prabha had been dead for 7 days by the time that his friend said, "Hey, Shakyamuni, what happened to our friend Vimalamani Prabha?" And that's, of course, as I said earlier, that's when they learned that he's gone to hell. And so some commentaries will say that this 7-day interval, because this number 7 comes up again and again in the bardo literature, was actually a reference in the Sarvadurgati to the bardo. But what's really fascinating is that some of the early commentaries who at least acknowledge this possibility are very strong in asserting that no, Like, he went straight to hell. He did not, there was no intermediate state. He was there for 7 days, he suffered a lot, and then through ritual means, he's saved. And so in the SDP, there's no bardo. In the commentaries on the SDP, there's mention of the bardo, but there's certainly no emphasis on the agency of the deceased in the bardo. So they can't do anything to save themselves. And then you look to the Tibetan sources, which are heavily influenced by, I mean, these are written by authors who know the highest Yoga Tantra material so well. They would see the bardo as an opportunity. But in order to be faithful to the textual tradition that they're a part of when they're writing about the SDP, they don't really go there. So Drapa Gyaltsen, he talks about the bardo, but he never frames it as an opportunity. He never says, even though like by his time, that's like certainly a possibility, like in the Tibetan understanding of things, he never frames it as an option for the dead, which I found really striking. And then I started reading later authors who are basing their works on Drapa Gyaltsen, same thing. Like they talk about the bardo maybe for a line. It's never framed like I just showed you, where it's this chance to sort of recognize reality, you know, cut through the delusions that are actually just a product of your own mind and save yourself. It's never talked about. It's really not until the 17th century I found one text that tries to integrate these two models of necroliberation. And so Ameshap, who's this very famous Sakyapa, wrote a text where he says, if you're following this particular ritual manual based on the SDP to rescue the dead, if you want to incorporate this other model that involves speaking to the dead and trying to help them recognize what they're seeing as an illusion and help them cut through, here's where you would do it, and here's what you would say to them. And so it's the only text I've found that actually tries to integrate these two paradigms of like either the dead have agency or they don't. And there may be other texts out there that do this, but I searched for years and nothing's come up. I talked to my advisor, Leonard Vanderkuyp. He's read extensively on this, and he hasn't seen anything. And so it's quite interesting that even though these two paradigms coexist in Tibet, the authors were very cognizant of staying true to the tantric source that they were basing their rituals on. So when they're performing a funeral based on the Sarvadrivati, they tend to stick to the principles of that text. And they don't tend to break away from the presuppositions of that earlier tantric moment. So they're very cognizant of like, this is a Yoga Tantra text, it's not highest Yoga Tantra. So I'm not going to step away from that. I'm not going to expect anything of the dead. I'm just going to perform these rites that will do that work for them. If we want to get into the higher yoga tantric practices, then that's like another story, and maybe use that for another context. I think I'll stop there just so we have time for a bit of discussion, but thank you so much for listening.